PhD, Washington State University, Home Washington. I did leave the state before 2007, however. I actually lived all over the state. But my degree is in mechanical engineering. All 3 degrees are in mechanical engineering. My research area, mechanical engineering, is very broad. So you have the degree, BS, whatever, in mechanical engineering, but then also go into in control systems, optimization, and game theory is what I really focused upon as I went through my research. But now I'm excited to be doing some multidisciplinary research, and especially in regards to clinical trials. So it's been exciting.
Good. We've been trying to think where we. So I think Dr. Patty Hamilton, my predecessor, introduced us. We were kind of playing with some research ideas with Dr. Medall's use of game theory, and so when I knew someone was working in another area, and we were working on another project together as well. It's optimization of a conscious sedation protocol with local physician groups. So our interest in this project is to reduce the radiation dose necessary to produce certain images, radiographs of the human body. So we'll talk about our process and where we are to date, and then a little bit about the clinical trials version. But clinical studies involves 2 broad areas, clinical trials and observational studies. We'll talk a little bit about those, and then our methodology and process. And Dr. McDonald will talk more in detail about this phase of producing a prototype or a clinical trials version. Kind of ratchets up the seriousness and the importance of the precision and control we have with this. So, clinical trials is one topic where we are. It's an interventional study or invasive. You're doing something physically with the patients in a hospital or clinical environment. These are usually well-designed protocols that test a gold standard against an experimental. And gold standards in this case are the current accepted practices, state-of-the-art, what we currently accept as the leading edge of medicine and so on. But we're always having to challenge that a little bit, trying to advance medicine. I'll give you an example. I won't go too long in this, but it's just kind of a funny comparison. Early on, when I first started my career, it was very difficult to image the brain, the structures of the brain. We did a study back then called pneumoencephalogram, and because the brain is a soft tissue, it doesn't show up on routine radiography. There are tissues that surround the brain, the arachnoid layers and subarachnoid space. There's fluid that surrounds the brain and the spinal cord. Well, the way to see the internal structure of the brain was to inject air in that subarachnoid space. And that sounds like something out of a horror film, really, but that was a gold standard practice. You sit in an upright position, you access the subarachnoid space, you inject air. That air rises to its highest point and goes into the ventricles of the brain. And I always think of it in cross-section. It looks like a butterfly within the brain. We want to see those structures, and it kind of gives us some indication of disease and so on. Once that air is injected, then we had these positions to distribute that air, so we take pictures at different points. It was called a pneumoencephalogram chair, and you sit down in this chair. It strangely resembled an electric chair. They strap your hands down, your chest down, your waist, your legs, your knees, and you're sitting in this position, and then your head. Then they tilt you forward. This chair will actually do a somersault forward and backwards, and it distributes the air so we can take pictures of different areas of the brain. I think you would be sued for malpractice even in a third world country for doing that now, but that was the gold standard. When we were training, it was kind of entertaining during lunch to go strap ourselves into a chair and do somersaults. But anyway, so we progressed, we challenged that standard, then we introduced CAT scan, or computed axial tomography, using x-rays, and it gave us soft images of the brain. Pneumoencephalograms went away. We challenged that again. We have MRI and magnetic resonance imaging, which came originally out of chemistry and science, nuclear magnetic resonance. And anyway, it gave the exquisite imaging capabilities of the brain. MRI is the gold standard for brain imaging. Now we're pushing that again with functional MRI, where we are fusing two modalities together so we can actually inject a tracer of radioactive materials and see which areas of the brain are activated during different stimuli. So again, we're always pushing the leading edge. So that's why we have clinical trials. We have a gold standard. This is practice today, but where should practice be tomorrow? And that's what we push towards. Observational studies are looking longitudinally, typically, at accepted practices. And just kind of give you another quick example. I have a strong family history of heart disease. I take an 81 milligram aspirin every day. I take my vitamin, I take my aspirin, because it reduces your chances of a heart attack under certain conditions. People that may are in the throes of a heart attack take an aspirin. It lowers your blood's ability to clot. That clotting mechanism, if you have fatty deposits in the arteries that supply your heart, and that breaks loose and then it clots around it, closes that artery, you have severe injury, even death related from. So we look at those, but again, we know that 81 milligram aspirin is effective, but is it effective in every population or every circumstance? So we do longitudinal study. Well, we know it's effective, but is it effective in women of a certain culture at a certain age and certain conditions, so on. So those are longitudinal looks at clinical trials or clinical studies. This kind of brings us a little bit more where we are today, and we'll get started into this stuff. But a lot of times we think about clinical trials as discovering new drugs or testing new drugs, and we have all the blinded studies. And again, it's challenging or trying to advance a gold standard. And that also applies to devices, which is what we're doing, and I'll talk a little bit about the difference. We're not changing a gold standard, but we're enhancing it a little bit, and where we are with that. Let's see. No, you can chime in anytime. I'm going to get to where we are and then just jump in. So testing a device or enhancing a gold standard, what we're doing in this study is not changing the way we normally image the abdomen of a certain population, but trying to enhance it. And our IRB approvals and so on will reflect what we're doing. But our initial phase last semester, we did a prototype, talking about medieval torture device looking things. It was very crude but effective. We needed to see that the theory worked, and that was that if we compress the abdomen, we can reduce the radiation dose necessary to produce an image. So let me back up just a little bit. When we X-ray an individual, when we radiograph an individual, we, as radiographers, select the radiation dose necessary to produce that image. The larger the person, the more radiation is required. We have today an obese culture. We keep changing the definitions of what is obese and morbidly obese, but all those things aside, individuals that are greater than 100 pounds over normal weight or ideal weight, morbidly obese populations, require a tremendous amount of radiation to produce those images. If we compress, we kind of walk a fine line. We can compress to a point where we reduce thickness, and reducing thickness requires less radiation. But there's a tipping point where, as you reduce thickness, you also increase density, which then causes the radiation dose to go the other way, to increase again. So we're trying to find that happy middle point where we can reduce radiation dose to the smallest point without tipping and starting to increase the dose necessary. So that was the whole point in this. We've seen it work in other areas. Mammography, screening mammography uses a similar principle of compressing breast tissue to reduce radiation dose, enhance image quality. And that's kind of one of the byproducts of reducing this radiation doses, that we do increase the quality of the image, the diagnostic quality, which is the whole purpose of doing these. So in our last semester's work, we did the prototype, we tested it in our lab, measured the reduction, 44% reduction in radiation dose. So we know it works. Now we pursue a clinical trials version. The biggest difference now is that the device has to be very precisely controlled. It has to perform consistently. Every time we apply it, it has to be predictable. It can't break down while the person is in compression. We need to know that the compression is uniform over the entire surface area. If we compress one side and more so than another, that causes uneven, called tissue densities of radiographic appearance. So we can create false images within that field, within the field of view. So it has to be very precise, has to be very easy to use. And we'll talk about workflow things on our side as Dr. McDonald talks about this.
And we'll expand a little bit further on in some concluding slides, but as you see the 4 categories up there, at first glance you think, okay, compression, you think pressure, pounds per square inch, pascals, whatever it may be, or just delivering a force, and that's something that we're all it's very common. We all, whether it's in our garage, have our various tools that we use. So it seems fairly simple, but when you see engineering side, radiology side, and then the physical build, I was kind of shocked by at first how simple it seems, but then all the details that you have to confront. So as we go through and get to the final slides, think about that clinical environment, and then think about how we deliver that force, and then put yourself in the position of a practitioner that has to, again, you're dealing with a human subject here, so it's actually, delivering force seems easy. I can deliver force with my hands, but it's kind of the details and relating it back to people, which I found the most fascinating.
Yeah, our initial group meeting, we were talking about the challenges. I knew there would be physical challenges to building something that would perform to the level that we needed. We started talking in our first group meeting and our two. We have one engineering, one radiology student that are working with us, and we started talking about, well, we can just do this, and oh, by the way, it has to be invisible to X-ray, so that kind of, the engineering says, okay, wait a minute, I can't, any metal within the field of view is going to show up. It has to be radiolucent acrylic type materials in the middle portion of our field of view. It's like, well, we can do this, it'll be sturdy enough to handle. It's like, oh, but by the way, a person has to lay on this at some point. So we're kind of bouncing back and forth, and now we're at the point, it's very interesting. I know that we are mentoring certainly our two students, and a continuation of that, but I'll say, I think Dr. McDonald agreed that they are just two members of the research team. I think, they got a crash course in research last semester, and they're still learning. There's still things to learn in this clinical phase, but they're a comfortable part of our research team. They have no problem stepping in. Rachel is constantly, it's like, well, how's this going to work in the flow of what we're doing, and what about this, what about that? And Ryan is interjecting with design ideas and modifications to help accommodate those. And now we're to a point of ergonomics. This thing has to be easy. The typical individual using this in a clinical setting is not somebody my size. We are one of the, most of healthcare, with the exception of physicians, are female-dominated professions. And they are usually average size females, and not that they're not strong, but when you're talking about moving, a 300+ pound patient, and you're trying to wield this device around, the ergonomics and ease of use have to come into play.
Well, it's interesting, just a little bit to follow up too, that we talked about limitations, and when we get to things like delivering force, measuring stress or strain, the engineers will think, okay, strain gauges, but then you start investigating, and companies say, we had this super flat material to mimic, I guess, human fat, and you try to do some research, and how do you solder a strain gauge onto super flat? You certainly wouldn't want to do that to a person. So there are all these hurdles that you go over that, how something like measuring force, we couldn't find a strain gauge that would bond with our super flat that we had. So there was something we learned there. So again, both Rachel and Ryan, and I think both of us, we make an advancement, then you learn something, back up, and go again. So.
Yeah, it's been interesting that like I said, the design where we are now, because I should catch you up. Well, we'll talk about the challenges I go through our process. Did you want to talk about some of the safety tests, some of the things we're at now?
I'll do that a little bit. I think.
Go a little bit further down. One of the challenges as we go into the clinical side of this is we need to know how many pounds of force we're applying to this individual and what that equates to. Our consent form right now describes it as the equivalent of a small child sitting on your stomach. About a 50-pound is what we're anticipating applying. But how do we measure that? And then with each crank of this handle that Dr. McDonald will talk about in a second, how many pounds does that increase the force? When we take this into a clinical setting, we've recruited our 2 local hospitals to conduct our trials. I'm finishing up with United Regional right now, but Cal West is on board with us, so we'll take these 2 facilities. But first is the personnel training. This is a new process added to a workflow, and it's just like workflow in any other environment. So we need to walk this into there. We need to train the individuals on how to use it. Well, that means we have to train ourselves first. How best to incorporate this into a workflow situation. In this case, Rachel and I know how to do a routine abdomen x-ray, but how do we get this patient in? How do we incorporate this device, compress, and then move this forward? The importance of workflow is it's a volume process. In clinical practice, see a patient about every 10 minutes. That equates to about 50 patients a day. When you introduce a device like this, I'm resistant initially. I was like, look, I have a lot of people that I need to see before this day is over. I can't be bogged down with something that's too difficult, too cumbersome to get in place, to apply. We have the gold standard. They just know they're going to get an extra dose of radiation. So we need to get rid of that mindset. And this is important. This is for quality and patient safety and improvement of imaging process. So we have to integrate this with a workflow. We have to address safety issues and consistency. So you'll hear Dr. McDonald talk about pinch points and the precision of the device. When it compresses, we know exactly how much it's delivering with each, that it doesn't back off, that it's applying consistently, that it will release when we want it to release, so on. So there are a lot of issues with that. And then collecting our data in a clinical setting. Again, I've been involved with several clinical trials, things at MD Anderson, and it's a lot of paperwork for the individuals. We have a data sheet that we try to simplify as much as we can, but after a point, this is just essential. We have to have this information to analyze data and draw conclusions at the end. So try to make it as easy as we can, but again, it's going to add to the work and it's going to add to the time a little bit. There's a learning curve as you get more proficient with the device. The workflow will pick back up to its normal level and you'll move back through. Our IRB approvals, again, we're using human subjects in research. We have a consent form. Make sure that the patients understand that it's strictly voluntary. They can withdraw any time. They don't have to participate. We explain any potential risks. The risks are very minimal because we're enhancing a gold standard. There are certain things that would exclude these individuals from participating. There are, if you've just had abdominal surgery and you have a big incision with staples, you probably not want us to mash on your belly very much. If you have an aortic aneurysm, certainly we don't start mashing around on those. There are indwelling devices that are typically placed superficially in the abdomen. We want to mash those, mess with those. So there are certain things that we want to make sure that we avoid. Our design, we can't x-ray for experimental purposes. I can't just recruit this class and say, hey, we're going to go x-ray your abdomen and just see what this thing does. X-ray examinations, radiographic examinations are only by order of a physician, and there has to be a medical necessity. What we'll do is we'll recruit patients that come in, they have already had an abdominal exam within the last year. That's our baseline data. We'll capture those doses. They've had a new one ordered for whatever reason. We perform this with compression, then we have data to compare both sides, so we're not x-raying for experiment's sake. So I think that was all those. Now, one of the nice things, you always have if you have some of this, invented some different things, different times in my life. It's really cool to have a brother that can build all those things that I invent. So my brother, one of my brothers is a master machinist, very interested in this project, wants to work on the build. And so he is our physical builder for the device. There's just a couple of things that he's built. This looks huge and crazy, and it is, but it has to deliver a very control level of precision and accuracy and consistency over time. And what we're asking it to do physically is very difficult. But we have the materials. This is the initial. This is the gear and the that will actually deliver the compression part. I'll let, like I said, Dr. McDonald talk about those. But we're in the process of building the device now. We're doing all the background work, so I'll let you talk about the challenges from this point. So.
And I'd really like you to keep in mind that I came from an engineering background, or come from an engineering background, so even before I decided to be an engineer, I worked in a machine shop in the summers, I think 4 or 5 summers. Fortunately, I'm not a machinist, no talent, but fortunately my best friend's dad owned the shop, so I wasn't fireable. So I learned a lot on the job, and what's amazing is this type of work, this type of design, and that type of creation is absolutely impressive. What I'd kind of like you to imagine is, this is fairly traditional, you would say, mechanical engineering manufacturing. So that's some of my formal training, along with some of the mathematics and physics and chemistry. So engineers, we feel pretty comfortable with things that look like this, whether they're gears that are going to allow us to dictate power transmission, force, things like that. So what I want you to keep in mind as we go through is think about all the little issues that pop up as we attempt to apply engineering knowledge to the clinical setting and vice versa. So let's see here. I think we titled it Next Steps. So when we think about clinical testing, one of the things I had to overcome a little bit was really reflect on the mechanical performance. Like I mentioned earlier, we had the super flat material. We couldn't find a great way to accurately measure the force. A lot of the traditional engineering devices, like I said, strain gauges or piezoelectric materials that produce a voltage when they're stressed or displaced, they're just not applicable in the setting. For example, my brother worked on a Boeing 777 testing and development out of Renton, and he would go on the test flights before it was actually released for commercial use. He was an electrical engineer, but there were mechanical engineers right with him, and the mechanical engineers would be very curious about, in the new, latest and greatest composites, whether it's the wing, the floor, the seats, whatever it is, what are the stresses, the forces acting, what are the displacements? So taking that, and now we have to go into the clinical setting. And I'll probably say it a few times as we go through here, but gear ratios are something very, very interesting. We can take, a gear ratio dictates really the velocity, so you can relate, in effect, transform one speed to another speed, and also both power and torque. You can have an input amount of torque or power, and a gear ratio can amp that up or actually lessen it just a little bit. So when we think about in the clinical setting, there's a human there, and we have to be very careful, because you can work with gears. You can have these gear ratios, again, think speed and torque, where it's very easy to input just a little amount of torque on one end, the input end, and output a large in magnitude amount of force or torque. That's one thing we have to keep in mind, and the alternate is true as well. You can have very little output torque, but you really have to crank away on this handle to be able to deliver that. So right away, thinking about just those two scenarios, and then with a human involved, we have to be very careful. Go ahead.
And we talked about that in one of our discussions, that Rachel was wanting it very easy to use, and Dr. McDonald's explained to us that, well, we want it easy to use, but you don't want it so easy that you don't realize the force you're applying on the other side. You need to feel something as you torque that or turn that wheel to know that, okay, I'm putting some serious pressure on this individual. So we're trying to find that balance of what we're doing.
And that's why I think it's important I'll speak for myself and Ryan, to learn about the methodology and process on the clinical side, because, yeah, you can just pick out 2 gears, vastly different number of teeth, and crank up that gear ratio. But on the clinical side, that has some serious ramifications. And so we need, ultimately, let's say this becomes obviously used in the hospital clinical setting, used commercially, someone has to know very precisely, maybe not even just by feel, what force they're delivering it. What if you spin the wheel? That can really ratchet it down. That might not be optimal. A few things as well. Dr. Johnston talked about needing to deliver that consistent amount of force or pressure. And we have bending moments. If you imagine, and Dr. Johnston knows better than I do, but a table, obviously, when we apply a force via plates, 17 by 17 roughly, or We have 14 by 14.
The imaging area is 17 by, but we use 20 by 20 to clear.
With the, yeah, so you have the two plates, and there's obviously an object in between the plates. There are different fundamental forces like bending moments that act. And so how do we enforce a consistent pressure? That's not a trivial question. So it's something we're going to have to test for and something we're going to need to find a way to measure forces so we know that, okay, are our plates not delivering the same type of pressure or force, and we'll have to monitor that. Because, as Dr. Johnson mentioned, if you have that inconsistency, you maybe get good images on one end, but there's that tipping point, as you mentioned, that you may get worse images, not enough force, you may make the patient uncomfortable, too much force, and so those are something we had to consider on the engineering side when we actually got to the understanding the methodology for the clinical side. Let's see here. This is another thing we all grappled with a little bit. Dr. Johnson had, and I think it's correct, you've been thinking about this device for several years now. We had the superflab, and it was a material that mimicked, I guess, what's the best way?
It's close to human fat. It's a soft, rubbery type material. It's used in radiation therapy, but it was as close as we could find to simulating human fat. So we took this average size phantom that we practice on, radiograph practice, and we layered a couple of these things on, and it simulated a morbidly obese individual, in radiographically and radiation dose and so on. But it really doesn't have the same behavior as a human abdomen. It's a cavity, so it will. When you press on your abdomen, or even when you lay on your back, your abdomen kind of self-compresses and kind of spreads out. So it helps us out a little bit. Apply a little more force, it adds to that process. But
and so we were able to use that superflab and really almost modeling the superflab as a linear spring, which you see down below just a little bit. We attempted to get a very rough idea as to, okay, what type of force are we applying? But again, it was very difficult because we have the phantom that's a certain contour of the abdomen, then that superflab. So we want to maybe do a double or triple check onto, okay, we have this device that's going into the clinic to be tested, we have our IRB approval. How are we going to feel confident that we're creating this constant force, knowing again that traditional things like strain gauges, a lot of different transducers that hook up nicely to a computer just aren't available to us given our constraints. So we know theoretically we can calculate things like forces, again, speed ratios, power delivery, theoretically. So that's one way we're going to go. Dr. Johnson's brother will have these, working with rack and pinion, working with worm and wheel, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But we have these theoretical calculations that'll give us one measure of what's happening here in terms of the force. But then we're really thinking of going into something like a linear spring. If we have a linear spring that has a free length, it has a spring constant. And again, working at that machine shop, I went once to a foundry, and down, seemed to me like 18 levels below ground in a very dark room, they created these springs. And I would go collect some for our machine shop, but they can make these very accurate springs, and the spring constant is a force per length, basically, so like a Newton per meter. So if it has a free length, you compress it, there's a very predictable amount of force that it's going to exert on it. Same thing, if you have the free length, you pull out, a very predictable force. So we may have to use a variety of hookup points on this device that we have and use as accurate as possible linear springs to predict and see, okay, the plate's here, what's the force it's delivering here, and get an idea as to what force it's delivering. Hopefully, that force is something in the ballpark of what theoretically we've calculated as well. So we may literally, and MEs, we talk about the spring mass damper analogy all the time, we may literally use masses and springs and displacement to get a good idea, double check as to what we're doing is correct. There are things like load cells and effective scale like we used for our first trials. We might use something of that nature as a third methodology to try to back up, feel confident about what we're doing. But we need some idea working with humans that theory, experimentation, we know we're in the right ballpark, but because we're dealing with the clinical side, the usual engineering, fancy equipment, the transducers that plugs right into your computer and you get a nice graph, that's not working right now. Yeah, some of the mechanical components, I believe we're going to have a rack and pinion. Basically the rack's a linear track, a pinion's just a gear in effect. But you may have heard, I think in the 90s, I heard a lot about rack and pinion steering, different things on car commercials. But the idea is we're going to need some adjustment linearly, I guess you could say vertically, of this device. And so a linear track with teeth would allow us fairly easily, again, just to pick out a gear and turn a handle and have this motion adjusted in the vertical direction. But we have to be pretty careful. Again, depending on the gear ratio, the number of teeth on that rack with the number of teeth in that gear, you may have to make a lot of rotations to move just a little bit, or move a little bit and you move a lot. And either one of those scenarios, you have to have the right balance, because there's that workflow. You don't want to have someone spin a handle 9,000 times for it to move 4 inches downward in the vertical direction. So there are workflow issues associated with that. Also, you can't have someone spin it lightly and have it just drop very quickly. So there are going to be some safety factor issues, or maybe some hard stop issues as well. Now, when we get to the force application, we're going with a worm and wheel, and the worm is almost it's kind of like the first picture you saw. It's basically a worm and wheel translates motion and power between the 2 perpendicular shafts. The idea is you almost have one linear, cylindrical bar, like you saw laying on, I think that was on a lathe bed in the picture. But a worm actually really only has one tooth, but it's just kind of serpentine along the length of this bar. The wheel, again, is just a gear. But the neat thing about the worm and wheel is they can allow for very large gear ratios. So that means very little input force to deliver a lot of output force, or a little speed, deliver a lot of output speed, and vice versa. The other thing that's interesting is, which can be good and bad, is the worm, make it correctly, it can be self-locking. And that's a good thing in that we're applying pressure to this phantom, these testing, ultimately people. We can't have a clinician let go and then boom, force puts it back up. But also on the other hand, what if there's an emergency, or what if you need to get out? You can't have a force applied that you can't undo. So we're going to have things like hinges, safety factors, releases, pins, and keyways to get around to where, yeah, we get the results we want. This will apply the constant pressure. But yeah, what if you wind it down too much? You got to get that thing back up and out of there quickly. So there are a lot of issues that worm and wheel are good, but be a little bit careful with what you're doing.
This, I've had this idea. I created a crude version at Anderson about 20 years ago. I didn't have the access to the expertise and the other lab things to build. But basically, you have two. It sounds very, very simple in my mind until you have to make it work. But 2 20-inch by 20-inch plates. One is on top and one is behind the individual, and they're pressing together. So you have one point of attachment, and it's pressing on the abdomen like this. Very simple in idea, but all of the engineering that has to go into so that the point of attachment is not squeezing down this side and opening up this one. It has to be perfectly parallel to each other in their compression. And as I said, we have to have it come down. We can't let it take all day. We don't want to be like watching snails race. It's like, okay, this thing has got to come down at some point, but with enough precision and enough control that, like I said, we're not going to hurt anybody as we go through this. So, fortunately, my brother and Dr. McDonald, speak the same language and how to accomplish this task. But again, the same thing. Once that force is applied, it needs to be released when we release it. We back it off. When we get to the really cool, if this all works out very nicely, and we get to the marketing and mass use of this, I'm sure they'll have really cool, sleek, Jaguar versions of this, and electric drive to move this back and forth, and the LED readouts, all that kind of jazzed up stuff. But we have to make a version that shows clinical use is possible and efficient and safe. So,
a few words. Also, I know there's a quiz involved, so I wanted to cover a few things. When we talk about ergonomics, a week or two ago, Dr. Johnston and Rachel came over to McCoy and looked around our manual machine shop. And there are several lathes. One was a semi-blend CNC/traditional lathe, and then there was an older one that's definitely just a 1940s era lathe. And similar idea, you can move the workpiece in basically really three directions, but there was a particular handle that governed the motion as you turn a shaft, governed motion, let's say, along the longitudinal axis of the shaft, and the handle was, I don't know how to, just a normal handle, but it had just a little, almost a little grip, a little knob, and you don't want to be seeing 10, 20, 50, however many patients a day you see at this height. I mean, this is literally how I had to work that lathe, and right now, I almost just threw my shoulder off just then, actually. But it's something like the type of handle, I believe, was it Rachel said, longer handle, maybe bowl at the end,
yeah.
Something much more comfortable. So something like picking out a rack and pinion with a handle that just makes it comfortable for someone to do that all day, that's a huge issue to deal with. So we need this to be very easy, very quick, but also very doable. I've had to turn a lot of parts again at that machine shop, and there are some machines I liked better than others. You don't want to be doing one repetitive task when it's very uncomfortable. People aren't going to want to use the device. We all know that you can have various issues with repetitive injuries, and so that's obviously something we want to avoid. Also, what if we do need a large amount of force, or what if there's in a situation where you very quickly better have this fold out of the way? You can't have, trying to deliver a large force with some tiny handle. We need to think of, if this happens, it'll be easy to do. If that happens, this will be easy to do. So something like a handle is going to be very important. And that goes down to the force application as well. We don't necessarily want such a big moment arm and handle that we can just ratchet up and deliver an incredible amount of torque when we don't want to, even if we accidentally do that. So again, a handle and a worm and wheel, it's going to have a lot to do with the precise positioning, but also force delivery for better, for worse as well.
Yeah. So we've worked through a lot of the ideas. Like I said, we have our device laid out. We have several designs and modifications to that design. So like I said, we're getting to, now we're putting the pieces together, and give you an idea of size of some of these, because it really kind of, I guess, I was a little bit taken aback, saying, wow, they have to have material that sturdy to deliver this. My brother's using a 1/4-inch cold rolled steel plate, just a piece about the size of this, 100 pounds. I mean, this thing is, the weight and the size and the strength is just incredible. That one block, that nut is a 4-inch by 4-inch square, and I have 4 bolt holes through that to hold it to the plate. I mean, like I said, this, I'm thinking, well, it's just simple. I just needed to mash this person's abdomen a little bit. But to do that the way we need to do it, the engineering that goes into it is just crazy to me, the materials that we're going to use. So, did you?
I think I covered most of it, but one thing I'd like to keep in mind, maybe a couple takeaway points. We've mentioned a lot of, obviously, X-ray dosing. There's a limit, there's a reason why we're all doing what we're doing. But also, mechanical solutions, I like things like gears, nuts, because they're very strong, robust. They tend to, if you take care of them, the power goes out. It's not like the machine stops. So there are some good things about very mechanical components. But we have a rack and pinion. We have gears. We have cold rolled steel plates. We have nuts that big. You got to worry about pinch points and what can happen here. I don't want my stomach near a lot of gears. So little issues like that, like proximity of your stomach to a gear train, and things like the machine shop, which I didn't think about till I worked there. I better not wear gloves and baggy clothes when I'm working machines, or better be careful about my hair. All those issues are going to come into play on this device. And then finally, like Dr. Johnson said, you can spend $1 million on this, adding in the LED displays, this or that. But we have to consider ease of use, quickly. If something breaks, can we fix it? Or is it like my Dodge Caravan where the tail light wouldn't turn off? They said, oh, it's simple. Just buy a new $800 computer. Perfect. So those are all issues that we're going to have to deal with.
We're working through, the design of this right now is, it'll come apart in 2 pieces. And obviously we're talking about several hundred pounds when this thing is all put together. I don't know if you're how familiar you are with X-ray equipment, the portable X-ray units that we tool up and down the halls with. They're motor driven and all this kind of stuff, and we drive those all over the place. The old ones, the Mark IVs, were about 1,500 pounds. So we've lightened those up considerably with the microchip technology and all the other things that we do now. But this is starting back at that era of a device. So it'll be mechanical, it'll be very heavy. As it's incorporated into mainstream practice, then you find what you can strip away, what has to remain, and they'll like I say, computerize it, make it very cool and very sleek, and racing stripes and all that kind of stuff on it. But right now it's got to be just a clean and easy to use device. And again, we have to worry about ergonomics. And it sounds silly, but a lot of the things that we do in healthcare in general are repetitive, especially the healthcare, the allied health side of things. The more physical, hands-on with patients. Again, I have 50 patients a day, and I'm using the same piece of equipment the same way, hundreds of times a week and thousands of times a month, and so on and so on. Develop a lot of repetitive stress, repetitive motion injuries that we always and I have to, if I offend anyone, I apologize, but in litigation-driven medicine, you have to be worrisome with that because somebody wants to sue you for a device that caused this long-term injury over time. So mindful of those as we go forward. So I think we have a lot of those. Our goal right now is we will have this built and pick it up in early March. Have it in the hospitals. We'll do testing. We already realized that this is going to certainly go beyond this semester, and we have 2 seniors that said, we don't care. We'll stay with you till it's done. I'll work remotely from wherever I end up. So anyway, so they're committed to the project, which is awesome. It's just we'll have in clinical trials. We'll have initial data collection. We'll have some use things, but obviously with the complexity of design, there's going to be some tweaking of this as we go along. So, did you have any last points, questions? Yes.
Will the device be designed here at MSU, or?
Yes, the design has originated with us. I sent the drawings, ideas, schematics to my brother, and he's doing the physical build. So, but it's to our design and specifications. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, is it going to be manual only, or will it be automatic too, or is it just going to be manual?
The first one will be manual, and that's the way, if you think about it in mammography, if you're familiar with that, mammography compresses the breast for a similar reason. The early ones of those were mechanically driven to compress. Now there's a motor drive, there's a little foot pedal, you step on it and it starts driving this thing down. And there's a little digital readout that giving you just ticking off pounds of force. And it sounds scary, but we're talking about 50 pounds, but they deliver generally 25 to 40 pounds to the breast when they do mammography. So 50 pounds is,
Well, I think they probably are not familiar with that process. They are too young.
With mammography, yeah.
Mammography.
They always tell us it was designed by a man, but
yeah, that's what it is.
which it was. But did you have a question? I'm sorry.
Yeah. How difficult has it been to start talking with hospitals to get them to actually let y'all do testing with it at hospitals?
Actually, both have been very accommodating, very excited about it. One of the nice things about Midwestern State University and this community is a very supportive area population of things that we're doing. And when we start talking about research and design and even the applied things that we do, improving quality and so on, a lot of folks, industry is very excited about that. It's like, wow, that's cool that that's in our backyard. I talked with Dr. Jerry Myers is the CEO of CalWest, and I called him, just explained what we're doing. He goes, oh, absolutely. So we have to do that here. So I'll talk to people. We'll make that happen. I spoke to Phyllis Cowling, the CEO of United Regional, on Friday, and absolutely said, yeah, this is cool. It's very exciting. Passing my information along to the individual that will set it up in the hospital. But when you're doing some of the very scary things of abandoning a gold standard of practice, now you cause a lot of uneasiness, and there would be uneasiness here on campus in the IRB approval process. People have to review that. It's like, wow, that's That's getting out there, that's getting kind of scary. Do we have all the expertise, you know, in place to do that? But enhancing a standard is, you know, I think an easier sell. And it's not as that it's without risk, but those risks are minimal. And considering the benefits, if I can reduce the radiation dose to an individual by 40%, even 25%, that's huge. And I'll say this, and I'll stop for any other questions. But when I started my career, cosmic sources of radiation, you know, the radon in the grounds, the cosmic sources of radiation, background sources, all those things, were the dominant source of radiation in the human population in this country. Since the mid-'80s, we have doubled the normal background dose to the individual, and it's from medical sources alone. So it's now the dominant source with 3.6 millisieverts per year. So all of the cosmic sources, background sources combined, we are half again more than that. So, and we have a culture, and it's there's health risk with that, and it's my family. I come from talk about genetically stacked against me. I come from morbidly obese family, heart disease, diabetes, colon cancer. I mean, when I fill out the list, my primary care is like, oh my gosh, he's scared marking all these things down. But I try to address those as much as I can. But we have a culture where we just eating is a part of what we do. It's part of our celebrations. It's part of drowning your sorrows. The chocolate will be consumed by the Valentine plans that went south, on Friday, that kind of stuff. But anyway, we're in that kind of culture, so we have to adapt our practices to deal with the people that we see in the clinical setting. So if there's a way I can do this and reduce the radiation dose in a very safe way, that's what we should do. So, yes?
I know it's a little bit more expensive, but why not use titanium?
We had a good source of materials.
Budget and access to materials.
Absolutely.
I know titanium's hard to get a hold of, but we use it for our racing, and I know it's really dependable.
Yeah, and for this prototype or this clinical version, we are, we're going to learn a lot about the bending moments, about the gear ratios. So, and that actually goes to a question you probably all will see. But yeah, they're going to be trade-offs. I think on the slide prior we talked about cost of materials, and so we validated the concept last semester, but this is still, we're going to have our first clinical prototype, and so typically what we do is either experimentally or physically, you build something as inexpensively as possible. Then once we say, hey, this worked perfectly, we know how to measure the force, do this, then absolutely we want to go to lighter materials, more durable materials. What if this was in a caustic environment, or then we'd absolutely want to address those concerns. But yeah, the next step, a commercial version, is going to look, I think, much different than this version that we have.
I think so, and Dr. Rincon can give us enough money to buy it.
You know that I don't control the money, you have to ask. Go ahead.
It's diamond studded.
Yes.
So.
You have a question?
I was just wondering how the device will look. Do you have like a prototype already, a sample, like
How
a
it will
design?
Yeah. Actually, my crude drawing I could show them.
And actually, the posters on the last at the forum last fall, but also I think posters on the go in March, correct?
March, yeah.
You'll be able to see on their poster the original device as well as long, and also Dr. Johnson will pick up the latest. You'll be able to see both the very original proof of concept and then this prototype.
This is, now you see why I practice something other than art. But the idea of this, and of course there'll be wheels here, but this upper part, this line will slide up and down over the base, so this will come apart in two pieces. The table that we x-ray from would be here. The patient, this will be underneath it, but the patient will be in between like this. So we're compressing the abdomen. So if you think of this as a loaf of bread slicing the patient transversely, this is spine, and then the abdomen across. So this device, when we crank this, will compress down this way. There's a lot of other things we have to consider. This is a very large patient. They're very difficult for them to move, and when they're ill, it's more difficult still. So we're trying to find a way for this to fold back out of the way. So that when we place this, then the patient lays down, then we can lock this in place and compress. The only problem is if you have it fold back this way, now you have the mechanical challenges of it being strong enough to resist. So then the idea is for it to flip this way. Now we have the issue is like, okay, they have to remember to flip that up, and then how do we get this one in place? So it's this constant back and forth. It's like, gosh, how are we going to... And you have to think it through. When you're talking about building this thing as large as it is and what it would be, we really have to solve as many of these issues as we can, because not having those worked out in the prototype is a complete redesign and start over kind of thing. But anyway, that's very simply. It has to roll up. Nothing can go under those tables, so it has to be, the wheels have to be set back so it will roll up flush with the table. This one slides underneath, this one slides on top, and you can compress. We have the X-ray tube is in a housing, we call it an overhead tube crane. It rolls in rails along the ceiling, moves along and places over the patient. The image receptor is inside that table, what records the image. So we have to play with a lot of workflow kinds of things to get these all to play nice together when we introduce it. So, was there another?
You go ahead.
Just, you were talking about the material and having to find a way to make sure that it distributes an even force. Does temperature change the way the force, like, would you be able to calibrate the machine? Because like, y'all are building it here, I'm saying in Alaska, the material would actually would it make it a different reading?
Well, for example, if you just look at the materials that our springs are made out of, so we'd have to basically go into, and if we make a custom spring, meaning we have whether it's off the shelf, but probably a custom spring constant, so it's going to have a unique spring constant. So what if we said, yeah, from Fairbanks, University of Fairbanks, I'm not sure if they have a medical school there, if it's in Anchorage, but yeah, what if they deliver these and it's somehow Arctic environment outside? Yeah, we'd have to decide, well shoot, if this is going to be in a cold environment, we'd have to change the way we measure the force. Now, most of these are going to be inside, hopefully, hospitals, room temperature sort of thing. But then again, a lot of the engineering projects, in this case away from the clinical trials, but when they dig like tunnel, they have the big tunnel boring devices to let trains pass through mountains, like let's say in Europe. You've got a lot of equipment that's manufactured room temperature, but it's in very hot, very, very cold environments. Airplane turbine, very hot to very cold on the outside. So if this ends up in a strange environment, that changes the material we use and how we measure the force, absolutely.
And we keep the environment in the hospital. We always feel like it's Arctic environment anyway, because we're supposed to wear scrubs and it's just so darn cold in there. But germs don't breed as well in cold. But I mean, but the temperature inside should stay relatively constant, 68 degrees or so. But you're right; those are issues of then portability of the device. Is it one of those that we can take into the field, or is it one of those that are permanent install versus mobile kind of thing? So.
And you mentioned germs. I mean, does the material y'all use in the actual table come into sanitation, like how y'all design it? Y'all have to think of how easy is it to sanitize whenever?
Yeah, their tops is similar to this, but yeah, it's but we spray those down, Cydex, spray down with each patient and so on. But yeah, we don't want a porous material that, so we always talk about those, like the old wooden cutting boards, you have all your raw chicken on those cutting boards and soaking up all that, Of course, we grew up doing that and we're still alive, but I don't know. So, but yeah, you're right. So the parts that will be in contact, physically in contact with the patients, are the steel frame that will hold those acrylic plates and then the acrylic plates themselves. And that presents yet another challenge. We're using this based on 1/2-inch acrylic plates and hoping we don't blow out the middle of this when we start compressing, and because it's held firm along the edges, but there can be nothing in that 17 by 17 inch field of view. So, yes.
Will the arms eventually, maybe not for your prototype, will they eventually get to a point where they actually extend out?
They do. These will have to. I asked for 6 inches of adjustment side to side, and it's based on the width of the table to accommodate those. But yeah, and like I say, those arms are one of the biggest challenges, because it's a single point of attachment, and how strong those two things have to be to not allow that backside to flex.
Yeah, since this is going to be a new device, is there going to be any type of training to like a nurse or doctor who is going to use this for the
Yeah,
first time?
When we take it into the clinical environment, we'll have to play with it, learn ourselves, the easiest way to incorporate that into workflow. Then we have to go in and train the staff, the radiology staff that will be using this. Rachel will be one of our primary in United Regional for data collection, and then a trainer for the folks using it in there. We'll have to recruit somebody and train in Cal West to do the same thing.
And it's interesting because I'll get to learn a great deal as well, Ryan, about the process, but obviously Ryan and I have different expertise. So, for example, in a clinical setting, I can't go do things that Dr. Johnston and Rachel can do with patients. I don't have the education and certification. So, if we get permission from the patient, I can observe, but so it'll be a learning experience for me, but also, again, that interdisciplinary research. There are some things I can do and some things just can't do, but there'll be that training, and I'm looking forward to learning as much about it as I can, even though I won't ever physically, I don't think, interact with a patient, because I just don't have the credentials to be able to do that.
But needing them there, or having them there, is absolutely critical to observing the device in practice and action. And I can go back and talk to him all day long. It's like, well, it's doing this when we do. It's like, no, you just need to come and see. And then there's ideas. A lot of this, I've taken them up and shown them some of the equipment we have, kind of some of the ideas where this originated. And he says, oh, why don't you do this? And that'd be so much easier than what I had in mind. So, just that outside